Hey, sixth graders, we are going to finish up this chapter today, chapter 2, our study on ancient Mesopotamia. Really, it's an overview. There's so much more we could have talked about. We just don't have time in a class like this, but hopefully it gives you an idea of some different things that you can add to your studies later. Or maybe it tells you, I'd be really interested in studying this when I'm older and get to college or whatever. But it'll give you a good basic idea of our history as humans, and so much human history happened in this area of the world. So we talked about the Akkadian Empire, and we're on page 27 in your student activities manual, right here. We've already done the Akkadian Empire, so today we're going to do these last 4. And I have written on the board kind of the blanks, and we'll talk about that as we get there. So, the Amorite civilization, aka the Babylonian Empire. I just wrote Babylon up here. I should have written Amorite civilization, Babylonian Empire. The Sumerian civilization, the Akkadians, fell to these people called the Amorites. The Amorites established the empire we know as the Babylonian Empire, or the first Babylonian Empire, and their capital was the city of Babylon. Their capital was the city of Babylon, one of the greatest, biggest, most beautiful cities in the world. It was on the Euphrates River near modern-day Baghdad, Iraq. So if you were to look at a map of the world and you were to find the country of Iraq in the Middle East and then find Baghdad, which is its capital, you would know that Babylon was very near there. Babylon, because it was on the river, was a center of trade. And according to the Bible, the city of Babylon began shortly after the flood. There was a man named Nimrod, who was the great-grandson of Noah, who founded a kingdom that included Babylon. And you can read about that in Genesis chapter 10. Historians think that this is probably near where the Tower of Babel was built. Now, there was one king in particular that we're going to talk about with the Amorites, or the first Babylonian Empire, and that was a man named Hammurabi. Hammurabi, very, very, very important in human history. If you are at all interested in how laws are made and developed, you would be very interested in Hammurabi. He is remembered for a lot of things, but the thing that he's most remembered for is his code. So let's back up and talk about some of the other things. He built city walls. He built canals. He built up the city of Babylon into a successful, thriving trade city. So, city walls and canals for his accomplishments. But like I said, the third thing and the most important thing that he's known for is Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code contained a lot of ideas that are still found in laws today. Hammurabi's Code had 282 laws, and you think, wow, that's a lot, but it's really not. I mean, compared to our federal laws and statutes and codes, tax laws, and just all of these laws that we have for our national government. It's like the book that contains all those is something like 4 feet tall. I mean, it's a ridiculous number of laws. Hammurabi only had 282. Now, here was the point This was actually inscribed in the introduction to his laws. Pardon me, I have a tickle in my throat today. To cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak. The idea was that everybody should be subject to the law. Hammurabi's code was a code of retaliation. Specific crimes had specific punishments. It was interesting, though, that Hammurabi's code gave different punishments to different social classes. If you were a wealthy person, you had a different punishment than a poorer person, which we would say that's not fair, and it's not, but we still do that a little bit today, don't we? Rich people can afford better lawyers, and they tend to get off with lighter punishments than a poor person who can't afford a good lawyer. So while it's not blatantly as unfair as Hammurabi's code, it's still prevalent today. I want you to look at page 49, and you will see this big block. And what this was is it's called a stele, or a pillar. And this is decorated with a relief of Hammurabi to inscribe the laws, and the laws are written in cuneiform. And what Hammurabi did was he recorded all the laws on these stone pillars, these steles, and had them put everywhere throughout the kingdom so that everybody would know and understand the law. Now, let's move on to the Hittites. Hattush was the capital, and as far as our learning is going to go, you don't have to know any specific kings, but they did have a king. The Hittites were descendants of Heth, who was the grandson of Ham, and the great-grandson of Noah. There was, for a while, historians used the Hittites as evidence that the Bible wasn't real, because the Bible talks about the Hittites, but historians and archaeologists are like, there's no evidence, there's no evidence, there's no evidence. Well, it turns out that there is. In the early 1900s, there was some archaeological discoveries that confirmed the existence of the Hittites. So that's pretty cool. The Hittites began to settle in Asia Minor around 2000 BC. I want you to remember that Asia Minor is the peninsula that's between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So if you were to look at a map, you would find the Mediterranean Sea, and then above that is the Black Sea. There's a piece of land that sticks out there called Asia Minor. Well, that's what it was called back then. Now it's basically the country of Turkey. The Hittites were not ruled by priests or by gods. They had a king. The king was also the commander of the army. So they didn't have a priest king. They had a general king. The power of the king depended on the chief warriors. And the Hittites were well known for their iron production. The Hittites were among the first people to utilize iron, and they made the best weapons of their time. They also used something that was new, I guess, for the time period, and that was horse-drawn chariots. Horse-drawn chariots. The Hittites had, not a ginormous empire, but for the time it was a pretty big empire. You can see at the map on page 51 that there was, most of what's now known as Turkey is where the Hittite Empire spread. They went into Mesopotamia, and they took control of the Amorite capital of Babylon, but after that, other countries invaded Hittite territory, and the Hittite rule ended, and we come into the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire is one of the most interesting, I think, empires in history. It was the largest empire that the world had ever seen to that time. Now, we know of much bigger empires that came after the Assyrians. the Romans, the British Empire. Later on in the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, the British Empire was enormous. But up until this time, the Assyrians had the largest empire. Around 750 BC, by 750 BC, they had built this empire into just a huge empire. They conquered Egypt, the Fertile Crescent, part of Asia Minor, and their capital city was a city you may recognize the name of if you are familiar with the story of Jonah. Their capital city was Nineveh. Nineveh was a city that had been built by Nimrod, but it became the capital of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians adopted a lot of things from Sumerian civilization. They adopted their religion, their language, their art, architecture, literature, science, all of this stuff. They sort of went, oh, hey, that's good, and they adopted it. Now, what's really interesting to me is on your page 27 in your SAM, military accomplishments is one of your choices. However, you're not going to put this on the Assyrian Empire, which I think is interesting because, to be honest, you could. The Assyrians were militarily brilliant and very strong, but they were also very, very brutal. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I want to stop for a moment and say that one of their greatest accomplishments was their library. Nineveh had one of the best libraries in the world, definitely in the ancient world, and even rivaled later on the library at Alexandria. Just an excellent library. And because they saved so many things, historians have learned a lot from ancient cultures, from things that they found in this library. Now, let's go back to the Assyrian military. They had foot soldiers, spearmen, archers, a cavalry. They learned how to make iron weapons from the Hittites. So they had iron weapons, and they were very skilled with the war chariots. So some of the same things come over from the Hittites. I want to take a moment, though, to say that there is a difference between cavalry and cavalry. We'll talk about that several times over the course of the year, but a lot of times people will say Calvary when they mean cavalry. Calvary is the hill where Jesus died. Cavalry, 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 is soldiers on horseback. And so that's that word. And they had a cavalry that was very skilled. I actually have a book that's got pictures of paintings of what ancient different soldiers in different time periods looked like. And there's one of an Assyrian horse archer that is pretty impressive. Their horse archers rode with no saddle, and of course they had to shoot their bow and arrow, so they had to hang onto the horse just with their legs, which is pretty astonishing, and they were well known for that. Now, they earned their reputation for fierceness. They were absolutely terrifying. They burned crops, they looted villages. If a people that they were trying to conquer resisted, they would send in their forces. A lot of different things they would do. They would tunnel under city walls, which would cause the walls to collapse. They would climb over them on ladders, battering rams, all kinds of things that they did, and they were absolutely ruthless. One of the things that they did was they would take people that they had conquered, and they would take them out of their land, and they would go settle them in another land. So they would separate nations, whole nations. So a few people get to stay, but then they're going to move these other people in and take these people out and put them over here. And they did that to kind of keep people off balance. The Assyrian Empire stretched all the way from the Persian Gulf to the Nile River. And they divided their empire up into something called provinces. Each province had an official, a governor, and the governor would collect taxes, enforce the laws, do those kind of things. One of the other things that the Assyrians were known for, aside from their library, is the excellent system of roads that they built. And they built this system of roads in order to keep their empire connected. And they would actually station soldiers along the way, along the roads, so that traveling these roads would be safe. The Assyrians were absolutely, like I said, ruthless people. But God loved them, just like he loved everybody else. And at one point, he sent Jonah to them. He told Jonah to go to Nineveh, and you remember the story. Jonah didn't want to, because Jonah knew that these people were terrible. And he said, God, why do you want to save them? They're awful. They don't deserve saving. And Jonah actually had a pretty bad attitude about it. And God said, no, I want you to go preach to them. And he ended up in a whale, and then he ended up preaching to them. And the Assyrians repented for a while. In fact, Jonah was mad about the fact that they repented. He wanted God to destroy them right then. But God was merciful and turned away his wrath. However, they eventually returned to their wicked ways. And in 612 BC, a group called the Chaldeans came and conquered the Assyrians. The Chaldeans joined with a group of people called the Medes, and they destroyed the city of Nineveh, bringing that empire to a close. I want you to look at page 52 in your book. You'll see a photograph of from the 1930s of a worker on an archaeological dig, and this panel was from a gate in the citadel of King Sargon II. That's one of the kings that was written on already in your worksheet. And you can see how large this was. You can look at that's a grown man in the picture, and you can see how large just the head and shoulders of this piece of art was. So I just think it's really gorgeous and really amazing. The last empire we're going to talk about is the Chaldean Empire, also known as the New Babylonian Empire. Now, around 1000 BC, so circa 1000 BC, the Chaldeans began to come in and settle around Babylon. They were being overrun all the time by the Assyrian kings, and in 612 they had enough. They had enough, and they joined a group called the Medes, and they together destroyed Nineveh and set up Babylon as their capital city. Because of that, the Chaldean Empire is known as the New Babylonian Empire. In the Bible, in fact, it just talks about the Babylonians. It doesn't call them. Chaldean is mentioned, but what I remember, I might have to go back and look, but what I remember, it was mostly called the Babylonians. Now, they had a king, several notable kings. We're going to talk about just two of them. The first, Nebuchadnezzar, and the second is Belshazzar. Did I spell Belshazzar correctly? Yay, I did. Okay. I could spell Nebuchadnezzar, but I couldn't spell Belshazzar. So Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar are two of the notable kings. Like I said, they had several notable kings, but those are the ones we're going to talk about. So the first one, Nebuchadnezzar. We pronounce it Nebuchadnezzar. I have been told by people who know languages and stuff that it might have been pronounced something more like Nebuchadnezzar, but I actually don't know that for sure. So we're going to go with what our book says, which is Nebuchadnezzar. It was Nebuchadnezzar's rule where this Babylonian Empire, the Chaldean Empire, reached kind of just its peak, its pinnacle. In Jeremiah 27, God explains Nebuchadnezzar's success by saying that he gave these lands to Nebuchadnezzar to punish them, basically. Nebuchadnezzar is remembered for his military accomplishments, but he's also remembered for several other things as well. So we're going to write military accomplishments here, finally. Is it going to fit? If I write small, there we go. Okay. Honestly, we could have put military accomplishments on any of these because they were all militaristic societies, especially the Assyrians and the Hittites. But nonetheless, this is the one we're focusing on for that. He built up Babylon just to be one of the most beautiful cities. In fact, Isaiah 13:19 says, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees, excellency. So even the Bible describes Babylon as a beautiful, beautiful city. The Greek historian Herodotus, we'll learn about him later when we talk about the ancient Greeks, but he talked about it as well. In fact, he said, in magnificence, there is no other city that approaches it. Babylon was surrounded by a big wall. This wall was so wide that if you walked around the top of it, actually 2 chariots could pass side by side. That's how wide it was. So think about that. If it was a, even if it was only a 1-horse chariot, think about how big a horse is and how big a chariot is, and that you could fit 2 on the top of the wall. I mean, I could barely walk along the top of like a cinder block wall, right? So imagine a wall thick enough for 2 horses. There was also a moat around the outside. One of the most amazing features of Babylon was something called the Hanging Gardens. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The gardens, historians believe that Nebuchadnezzar built them for his wife because she missed the mountains of her native homeland. They were terraced gardens that contained trees and flowers, and because they were terraced and so high up from the ground, it looked like they were hanging in midair. So that's why they called them the Hanging Gardens. The city of Babylon, at least in this time period, when Nebuchadnezzar built up the city of Babylon, was literally built on the Euphrates River. So Babylon was on both sides of the Euphrates River, and the river ran through the city. Because it ran under the wall through the middle of the city, it supplied water for the city and watered the gardens. So it was a pretty beautiful place to live. Now, we learn from the book of Daniel that wise men were very important in the Chaldean Empire, or the New Babylonian Empire. But when they say wise men, they meant astrologers. Now, if you remember when we spoke about astrology, that is belief that the positions of the stars and the planets affect people's lives and can predict the future. The king would often use them as advisors to advise him, and they claimed that they had power to interpret dreams. But according to the book of Daniel, these were false prophets. In fact, in the book of Daniel, we see over and over and over again how they were not able to interpret the king's dreams. This empire did not even last 100 years. Daniel, when he was Nebuchadnezzar's advisor, showed Nebuchadnezzar God's power. But somehow Nebuchadnezzar still just didn't get it, and he was a very prideful man. In fact, in Daniel 4, chapter 4, verse 30, he says, "Is this not great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" And because of that, the king lost his throne and he became like a beast. If you read the book of Daniel, it says that Nebuchadnezzar kind of went crazy for a little while. And he was outside, he ate grass, his hair grew, his fingernails grew. It's kind of a really interesting description of what happened. He finally repented and God restored him as king, but his empire would end. Later on, Belshazzar, the second king that we have as an important or notable king for the Chaldeans, under the rule of Belshazzar, the Medes, again, the Medes had enough, and they joined with a group of people called the Persians to conquer the Chaldeans, and their empire was no more. Now, we're going to study about the Persians later on in a few more chapters. So for now, we have ended. Oh, I left off one thing off this other one, is that the Babylonians, or the new Babylonians, the Chaldeans, destroyed Nineveh. I forgot to write that down. So, we have finished this page, and you are going to turn that in, but I want you to start working on your study guide. So, test is going to be Wednesday. And so your study guide pages are, let's see, in your student activities manual, in your SAM, your study guide pages are 18, 21, 22, 25, 28, and 29. And you're going to want to do those study guide pages. You are allowed to use your study guide on your test, so make sure you get those pages done, and I will see you next time.